The clock on the wall of Carlos Mendez's home office showed just past midnight. Outside, the city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a soft glow across the room. Carlos ran his fingers through his dark, disheveled hair, frustration etched across his face. For the sixth night in a row, he found himself staring at the same whiteboard filled with equations and diagrams, searching for an answer that continued to elude him. As the CEO of Tech Vision Solutions, a company specializing in artificial intelligence solutions for supply chain management, Carlos carried the weight of a looming disaster on his shoulders. Their flagship algorithm, the one that had attracted their biggest clients, had developed a critical flaw. The issue wasn't just a minor bug. It threatened to derail operations for several Fortune 500 companies, potentially costing Tech Vision $200 million in contracts and damaging their reputation beyond repair. Still nothing, Carlos muttered to himself, capping his marker with more force than necessary. His team of brilliant engineers and mathematicians had been working around the clock for weeks, yet the solution remained out of reach. Tomorrow, he would have to face the board again with no progress to report. He slumped into his chair, loosening his tie. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional sound of movement from the kitchen. Carlos had almost forgotten that Elisa, his housekeeper, was still there. She often worked late on the nights when he had these marathon problem-solving sessions. At 45, Elisa had been working for Carlos for 3 years. She was quiet, efficient, and kept to herself most of the time. Carlos knew embarrassingly little about her, just that she had moved from Mexico about 5 years ago, and that she was reliable and thorough with her work. She was simply the housekeeper to him, part of the background of his busy life. A soft knock on the door broke his concentration. "Mr. Mendez, I made some coffee. Thought you might need it," Elisa said, entering with a tray. "Thanks, Elisa. Just put it on the desk," Carlos replied without looking up, his eyes still fixed on the whiteboard. Elisa placed the coffee on the desk and turned to leave. But something on the whiteboard caught her eye. She paused, her gaze lingering on the equations longer than a casual glance. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said something that Carlos couldn't quite catch. "I'm sorry," he said, finally looking at her. Elisa's eyes widened slightly, as if surprised she'd been heard. "It's nothing, sir. I was just talking to myself." But Carlos had noticed her intense focus on his work. "No, what did you say?" "About the equations?" Elisa hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "It's not my place, sir." "Please," Carlos said, gesturing to the whiteboard. "At this point, I'm willing to try anything." After a moment's hesitation, Elisa pointed to a section of the whiteboard. "Your constraint equation there. The coefficient is wrong. It should be negative, not positive. That's why your optimization function keeps failing at scale." The room fell silent. Carlos stared at her, then at the whiteboard, then back at her. In those equations were proprietary algorithms worth millions, concepts that had taken his team of PhDs months to develop. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and astonishment. Elisa looked down, suddenly self-conscious. "I noticed it while dusting yesterday. I've always been good with numbers, that's all." Carlos stood up and approached the whiteboard, studying the section she had pointed out. He worked through the equation in his head, following the logic to its conclusion. His eyes widened. This could be right," he said slowly. He grabbed a marker and made the change, then quickly worked through several related calculations. "This changes everything." He turned back to Elisa, who was now standing awkwardly by the door, looking like she regretted speaking up. "How did you see this when a team of engineers missed it for weeks?" Carlos asked, his tone softer now, genuinely curious. Elisa shrugged slightly. "It reminded me of a similar problem, from a long time ago." Carlos sensed there was more to the story, but Elisa's body language made it clear she was uncomfortable with the attention. He decided not to push further, at least not tonight. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I need to check this thoroughly, but if you're right, you might have just saved this company." "It's nothing, sir. I should finish cleaning the kitchen now," Elisa replied, quickly leaving the room. Carlos turned back to the whiteboard, his mind racing. If Elisa was right, and his initial calculations suggested she was, then the solution they had been desperately searching for had been spotted in seconds by his housekeeper. It made no sense. He grabbed his phone and took pictures of the whiteboard. then sent urgent messages to his lead engineers to come in early tomorrow. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. As Carlos worked through the night, applying Elisa's insight to various test cases, each one confirmed what seemed impossible. His housekeeper had solved in seconds what his entire R&D department couldn't crack in weeks. By dawn, as light began to filter through the windows, Carlos had confirmed that Elisa's correction was the key. The algorithm now worked perfectly at scale. He saved the company $200 million with one small change, a negative sign where there had been a positive one. But as the initial euphoria of finding the solution faded, questions began to form in Carlos's mind. Who was Elisa really? How could a housekeeper understand complex optimization algorithms? What else didn't he know about the woman who had been working in his home for 3 years? As he heard Elisa arrive for her morning shift, Carlos decided it was time to find out. This conversation would change both their lives forever, and in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Elisa wiped down the countertops, her movements automatic after years of following the same routine. She could hear Carlos moving around in his home office, probably still working on those equations. She regretted saying anything. For 3 years, she had been careful to maintain the invisible wall between employer and employee. 3 years of keeping her past hidden, of being just the housekeeper. And now, in one careless moment, she had risked everything. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Carlos stood in the kitchen doorway, his expression unreadable. His normally crisp button-down shirt was wrinkled from a night without sleep, but there was an energy in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Mendez. Would you like some breakfast?" Elisa asked, hoping to return to the comfortable routine they had established over the years. "Elisa, we need to talk," Carlos said, pulling out one of the kitchen stools. "Please sit down." Reluctantly, Elisa dried her hands on a towel and sat down across from him, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. "You were right," Carlos began. "The negative coefficient fixed the core issue. The algorithm runs perfectly now." He paused, studying her face. "But I think you knew it would." Elisa said nothing, her eyes downcast. "I checked your employment application from 3 years ago," Carlos continued. "It says you graduated from a public high school in Mexico City and worked as a hotel housekeeper before coming to the U.S. Nothing about advanced mathematics or computer science." "Didn't lie on my application," Elisa said softly. "No, but there's more to your story, isn't there?" Carlos pressed. No one casually spots an error in a complex optimization algorithm while dusting. That kind of insight comes from training and experience. The kitchen fell silent. Outside, birds chirped in the garden, oblivious to the tension inside. Finally, Elisa sighed. "I have a PhD in applied mathematics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico," she admitted. "I was an associate professor there for 6 years, specializing in optimization theory and algorithms." Carlos's eyebrows shot up. "A professor? With a PhD? And you've been cleaning my house for 3 years?" A flicker of something, pride perhaps or defensiveness, crossed Elisa's face. "Yes, and I've done it well. But why? With your qualifications?" "My qualifications mean nothing here," Elisa interrupted, an edge to her voice that Carlos had never heard before. "When I came to this country, no one would recognize my degree. The universities wanted American experience. The tech companies wanted American degrees. My English wasn't perfect. Always there was something." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured garden. "I had bills to pay. My mother back home needed surgery. I couldn't wait for the perfect job, so I took what I could find." She turned back to face him. "There's no shame in honest work, Mr. Mendez." Carlos felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. How many times had he walked past Elisa without really seeing her? How many conversations had they had that never went beyond pleasantries about the weather or instructions about dinner? "What about now?" he asked. "It's been 3 years. Your English is excellent. You could apply again." Elisa gave a small bitter laugh. "And say what?" "That I've spent the last 3 years cleaning houses. That my most recent reference is from my employer who knows me as his maid." She shook her head. "Besides, starting over is hard. After enough rejections, you stop trying." Carlos thought about the algorithm, about the elegant solution that Elisa had spotted in seconds. "But you still keep up with the field?" You understand current research? Elisa walked over to her bag hanging by the kitchen door and pulled out a tablet. After a few taps, she handed it to Carlos. On the screen was an academic journal article with complex mathematical notation. This is from the International Journal of Applied Mathematics, Carlos said, scrolling through the dense text. Published last month. I read it during my lunch breaks, Elisa said simply. Just because I clean houses doesn't mean my brain stopped working. Carlos continued scrolling and noticed something that made him pause. These annotations, these are yours? The margins of the digital document were filled with notes, corrections, and extensions to the proofs in the paper. Elisa nodded. Some of these insights are remarkable, Carlos said, genuinely impressed. Have you published any of this work? I submit papers occasionally under a pseudonym, Elisa admitted. It's easier that way. No questions about my current employment. Carlos handed back the tablet, his mind racing. In front of him stood a brilliant mathematician, someone who could easily be leading his R&D team, yet she was here dusting his shelves and washing his dishes. The absurdity of it struck him like a physical blow. Elisa, I want to offer you a job, he said suddenly, at TechVision. As a consultant to start, working on our algorithm issues. Elisa's eyes widened. Mr. Mendez, you don't have to do this. I shouldn't have spoken up about your work. I know my place. Your place? Carlos repeated, standing up. Your place is solving the kinds of problems that are costing my company millions. Your place is using that brilliant mind of yours, not wasting it on cleaning my kitchen. It's not that simple, Elisa said, shaking her head. Your employees, your board, they won't understand why you suddenly hired your housekeeper as a mathematician. Let me worry about that, Carlos replied. All I care about is that you solved in seconds what my entire R&D team couldn't figure out in weeks. That's the kind of talent I need, regardless of where I found it. Elisa hesitated, years of disappointment making her cautious. And if it doesn't work out, I would lose this job too. It will work out, Carlos insisted. But if it doesn't, I promise you can have your old job back with a raise. He smiled. Though I suspect we'll be having a very different conversation a few months from now. For the first time that morning, Elisa smiled too. A real smile that reached her eyes. When would you want me to start? How about now? Carlos suggested. We can go to the office today. I want to introduce you to the team and show them your solution. As Elisa went to change out of her work clothes, Carlos made some calls, setting things in motion. He knew there would be resistance, questions, maybe even mockery. His executives would think he'd lost his mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this decision, however unconventional, was absolutely right. What he didn't know yet was just how much this unexpected discovery would ultimately change not just Elisa's life, but the entire company, and his own understanding of talent, opportunity, and the invisible barriers that keep brilliant minds from reaching their potential. By the time Elisa returned, dressed in the most professional outfit she owned, Carlos was waiting by the door, car keys in hand. As they drove toward the TechVision headquarters, neither of them spoke much, both lost in thought about the dramatic shift that was taking place in their lives. For Elisa, it was a mixture of hope and fear. Hope that this unexpected opportunity might finally allow her to reclaim her identity as a mathematician, and fear that it might all fall apart once again. For Carlos, there was a growing determination. The woman sitting beside him had solved an impossible problem while being completely overlooked by society, by his industry, and by him personally. He couldn't help but wonder, how many other Elisas were out there, brilliant minds hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to simply look past appearances and really see them? The glass and steel TechVision building loomed ahead as Carlos pulled into his reserved parking space. He glanced at Elisa, who sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The confident mathematician who had corrected his equations was now hidden behind a mask of nervous anticipation. Having second thoughts? Carlos asked gently. Elisa took a deep breath. I haven't set foot in a corporate office in years. The last time I tried to get a job in my field, the hiring manager suggested I apply for a position in the cleaning staff instead. She smiled weakly, which I ended up doing, just not at that company. Carlos winced. Well, that's not going to happen here. Today you walk in as my guest. Soon you'll walk in as a valued team member. As they entered the lobby, heads turned. It wasn't often that the CEO arrived unscheduled, especially after pulling an all-nighter. Carlos nodded to the security guard and led Elisa to the executive elevator, aware of the curious glances following them. "Mr. Mendez," a sharp voice called out as the elevator doors were about to close. A hand shot out to stop them, and Diane Powell, TechVision's chief operating officer, stepped in. Her eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of Elisa. "Diane, good morning," Carlos said. "This is Elisa Ramirez. She's helping us with the algorithm problem." Diane extended her hand automatically, though confusion was evident on her face. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Ramirez. Which firm are you with?" Before Elisa could answer, Carlos cut in. "Elisa is an independent consultant, PhD in applied mathematics. She's already identified the core issue with our optimization function." The elevator arrived at the executive floor with a soft ping. As they stepped out, Diane touched Carlos's arm. "Could I have a word with you? In private?" "Of course," Carlos turned to Elisa. "Why don't you wait in my office? Lisa can get you some coffee." Once Elisa was out of earshot, Diane's professional demeanor dropped. "Carlos, what's going on?" "The board meeting is in 2 hours. We don't have time for mystery consultants." "And who is this woman?" "I've never heard of her." Carlos had known Diane for 15 years. They had built TechVision together from a small startup to a company with over 200 employees. She was brilliant, loyal, and extremely protective of the company and of Carlos himself. She solved the algorithm problem, Diane, last night. The negative coefficient issue that's been driving us crazy for weeks. She spotted it in seconds. Diane's eyes narrowed. "And you found her?" "Where exactly?" "Because she wasn't on our list of potential consultants yesterday." Carlos hesitated, knowing how the truth would sound. "She works for me, at my house." "She's your housekeeper," Diane stated flatly, her expression unreadable. "Yes, but she's also a mathematician with a PhD and years of teaching experience." Her insights on the optimization function were spot on. Diane closed her eyes briefly as if praying for patience. "Carlos, I know we're in a desperate situation with this algorithm, but this is unusual to say the least." "Unusual doesn't mean wrong," Carlos replied. "I want to bring her on as a consultant to work with the R&D team. If she can solve more problems like she did last night, she'll be worth whatever we pay her." "And the board? What do we tell them? That you've hired your maid to fix our multi-million-dollar technical issues?" Carlos stiffened. "We tell them I found an overlooked mathematical talent who solved a problem our entire team couldn't crack. Her previous employment is irrelevant." Diane studied him for a long moment. "You're serious about this?" "Absolutely. The team won't like it. Jack's been working on this algorithm for months. He's not going to appreciate some outsider coming in and showing him up, especially if—" She hesitated. "Especially if she's been cleaning houses instead of working at Google? That's exactly the kind of thinking I want to challenge, Diane." Finally, Diane nodded. "All right. It's your call, but tread carefully. You're not just hiring a consultant. You're making a statement." "Maybe it's a statement that needs to be made," Carlos replied. 20 minutes later, Carlos stood in TechVision's main conference room. Around the table sat the senior R&D team, including Jack Chen, the lead engineer who had been heading the algorithm project. Elisa sat quietly beside Carlos, her expression calm, but her fingers fidgeting with a pen. "I know this is unexpected," Carlos began, "but we have a breakthrough on the optimization issue. Elisa Ramirez has identified the core problem and proposed a solution that my initial tests confirm will work." Jack leaned forward, his face a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "What was the issue?" Elisa cleared her throat. "The constraint equation had a positive coefficient where it needed a negative one. It created a cascade effect in the optimization function, causing it to fail when scaled beyond certain parameters." Jack's eyebrows shot up. He turned to his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulled up the code. The room fell silent as he reviewed the changes Carlos had already uploaded. That's it? A sign error?" Jack finally said, looking up in disbelief. "We've been working on this for weeks, and it was a sign error?" "Sometimes the simplest mistakes are the hardest to spot," Elisa said quietly. "Especially when you've been looking at the same equations for too long. And you just saw it just like that?" another engineer, Priya, asked. "Yes," Elisa replied simply. Jack turned to Carlos. "Where did you find her?" The moment of truth. Carlos met Diane's eyes across the room, then looked back at the team. Elisa has been working for me as a housekeeper for the past 3 years. Before that, she was an associate professor of mathematics in Mexico. She has a PhD in applied mathematics with a focus on optimization theory. The room erupted in murmurs. Jack's face flushed red. Your housekeeper? Is this some kind of joke? Does anyone here care to argue with her solution? Carlos asked, his voice cutting through the noise. Because I've tested it extensively last night, and it works perfectly. No one spoke. Then I don't see the problem, Carlos continued. Elisa will be joining us as a consultant on the algorithm project. I expect everyone to treat her with the same respect you'd show any other colleague. As the meeting broke up, the reactions were mixed. Some team members approached Elisa with genuine questions about her solution. Others huddled in corners, whispering and shooting glances her way. Jack stormed out without another word. That went about as expected, Diane murmured to Carlos. It'll get better, Carlos replied. Once they see what she can do, they'll come around. And if they don't? Carlos watched as Elisa explained her approach to Priya, her face animated with the joy of finally talking about her passion. Then they're not the kind of people I want on my team anyway. The board meeting that afternoon was even more contentious. Carlos presented the solution to the algorithm problem, carefully explaining how it had been discovered and by whom. The reaction was immediate. Let me get this straight, said Howard Barnes, the most senior board member. You hired your housekeeper as a consultant on our most critical technical issue? I hired a PhD mathematician who happened to be working as my housekeeper, Carlos corrected. And she solved the problem that was threatening to cost us $200 million. It sets a concerning precedent, another board member added. What message does it send to our technical team? That their years of experience and credentials mean nothing? It sends the message that results matter, Carlos replied firmly. That we value talent wherever we find it. That we're not so blinded by resumes and traditional career paths that we miss brilliant minds right in front of us. The debate raged for nearly an hour. Some board members were concerned about the unorthodox hire, others about potential damage to morale, and a few worried about how clients might react if they learned about Elisa's background. Through it all, Carlos stood his ground. By the end of the meeting, the board reluctantly agreed to a 3-month consulting contract for Elisa, with the understanding that her role would be strictly limited to the algorithm project. As Carlos walked Elisa back to his car at the end of the day, both were mentally exhausted but cautiously optimistic. So I have a job, Elisa said, the reality still sinking in. You have a job, Carlos confirmed, though I can't guarantee it will be easy. You saw how some of them reacted today. Elisa nodded. I expected that. People don't like their assumptions challenged, especially when those assumptions are about who belongs where. Carlos unlocked his car and they both got in. As he started the engine, he turned to her. 3 months, Elisa. That's how long we have to prove them wrong. Are you up for it? Elisa smiled, a determined glint in her eye. Mr. Mendez, I've been waiting 5 years for this chance. 3 months is plenty of time to change a few minds. As they drove away from the TechVision building, neither of them could have predicted just how many minds would ultimately be changed, or how deeply their bold experiment would transform the company's future. 3 weeks into Elisa's new role at TechVision, the atmosphere in the R&D department had shifted dramatically. The initial skepticism had given way to something more complex, a mixture of respect, resentment, and reluctant admiration. Elisa had transformed a small conference room into her workspace, its whiteboard walls covered with equations and diagrams that few in the company fully understood. She worked methodically, often starting early and staying late, driven by a hunger that came from years of denied opportunity. Carlos watched from a distance, intentionally giving her space to establish herself. He'd made it clear to everyone that Elisa reported directly to him, bypassing the usual chain of command, a decision that hadn't won him any popularity contests among middle management. On this particular morning, Carlos found himself outside her makeshift office, coffee in hand, observing through the glass wall as she tackled a secondary issue with the algorithm that Jack's team had been struggling with. There was something Mesmerizing about watching her work, about seeing someone so completely in their element. She's something else, isn't she? Diane said, appearing beside him. Carlos nodded. In 3 weeks, she's resolved issues that have been on our backlog for months. The client presentations went extraordinarily well, Diane admitted. They were impressed with the improvements to the algorithm. We're on track to not only keep the contracts we were worried about losing, but also to expand them. That's $200 million saved, and potentially millions more added, Carlos said. Not bad for someone who wasn't even considered qualified to interview here a month ago. Diane gave him a pointed look. You're never going to let us forget that, are you? Would you if you were in her shoes? Before Diane could answer, the elevator doors opened, and a group of executives from Pacific Global, one of TechVision's largest clients, stepped out, accompanied by Jack Chen. Carlos straightened, switching to host mode. Gentlemen, welcome to TechVision. I trust Jack has been taking good care of you. Handshakes were exchanged, and Walter Donovan, Pacific Global's CTO, smiled broadly. Jack's been showing us the improvements to the supply chain algorithm. Impressive work. We're very pleased with the results. Excellent, Carlos replied. I'd like you to meet the mathematician who identified the core solution. She's just down the hall. Jack's smile froze. Actually, we're running a bit behind schedule. I thought we'd head straight to the demonstration in the main conference room. Carlos caught the look in Jack's eyes, a silent plea mixed with warning. Suddenly, he understood. Jack hadn't mentioned Elisa's contribution to the clients. Perhaps he hadn't mentioned her at all. I insist, Carlos said firmly. It'll only take a minute. He led the group to Elisa's workspace where she was deep in concentration, unaware of the approaching delegation. Carlos knocked gently on the glass door. Elisa, I'd like you to meet some people. She looked up, slightly startled, then quickly composed herself and stood as the group entered. Carlos made the introductions, watching closely as the Pacific Global executives registered Elisa's presence with polite but obvious surprise. Ramirez is the mathematician who identified the critical issue with our algorithm, Carlos explained. She's been instrumental in the improvements you've seen. Really? Walter Donovan turned to Elisa with newfound interest. Jack mentioned a team breakthrough, but didn't go into specifics. You're with the R&D department? Before Elisa could answer, Jack cut in. Elisa is a consultant. She's been helping us optimize some of the code. A consultant? Walter echoed, clearly curious now. From which firm? An awkward silence fell over the room. Carlos met Elisa's eyes, silently giving her permission to tell her own story however she chose. Elisa straightened, a quiet dignity in her posture. I'm an independent consultant, Mr. Donovan. Until recently, I was working as Mr. Mendez's housekeeper. The executives exchanged glances, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of joke. It's true, Carlos confirmed. Elisa has a PhD in applied mathematics. She spotted a critical error in our equations while cleaning my home office. That insight saved the algorithm and, quite frankly, saved this company millions. Walter Donovan's expression shifted from confusion to fascination. Now that's a story you don't hear every day. He turned to Elisa. Would you mind explaining how you identified the issue in layman's terms, if possible? Elisa nodded and turned to her whiteboard, beginning a simplified explanation of the coefficient error and its cascading effects. As she spoke, her natural teaching abilities emerged. She broke down complex concepts into digestible pieces, using analogies that even the non-technical executives could understand. By the time she finished, Walter Donovan was nodding appreciatively. Remarkable, absolutely remarkable. He turned to Carlos. You know, Mendez, this is exactly the kind of thinking we've been trying to foster at Pacific Global, finding talent in unexpected places. Jack Chen stood rigid, his face a carefully controlled mask that didn't quite hide his discomfort. We should continue to the demonstration, he suggested, checking his watch. Of course, Carlos agreed. Elisa, would you care to join us? The look of surprise on Jack's face was barely concealed. This wasn't part of the plan. Consultants, especially those with Elisa's unusual background, weren't typically included in client demonstrations. I'm sure Elisa has plenty of work to do here, Jack began. Nonsense, Walter Donovan interjected. I'd love to have her perspective during the demonstration. That is, if you're available, Ms. Ramirez. Elisa glanced at her whiteboard, then back at the group. I would be happy to join you. As they walked to the main conference room, Carlos held back slightly, falling into step beside Jack. You didn't mention Elisa to them, he said quietly. Jack's jaw tightened. I didn't think it was relevant who specifically found the bug. You mean you didn't think it would look good to admit that your team missed something that my housekeeper caught? Carlos corrected. With all due respect, sir, this isn't just about optics, Jack replied, his voice low but intense. Do you have any idea what this is doing to team morale? Half the department resents her for swooping in and solving their problems, and the other half is questioning why they spent years getting credentials that apparently don't matter anymore. They matter, Carlos said firmly. Just not as much as actual ability. Results matter. Solutions matter. Elisa has delivered both. The demonstration went smoothly, though with an unexpected twist. What was planned as Jack's presentation became an impromptu collaboration, with Elisa fielding technical questions that went beyond Jack's expertise. By the end, the Pacific Global executives were directing their most challenging queries to Elisa, who answered with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering her field. As they wrapped up, Walter Donovan approached Carlos. I'm impressed, Mendez. Not just with the algorithm improvements, but with the outside-the-box thinking in your hiring practices. He handed Carlos a business card. Have Elisa reach out to my office directly. We have some optimization challenges of our own that I think she might have unique perspectives on. After the clients left, the atmosphere in the R&D department was electric with tension. News of what had happened in the demonstration spread quickly. For some, it was validation of Elisa's talents. For others, particularly those aligned with Jack, it was seen as an embarrassment, being upstaged by a former housekeeper in front of major clients. By late afternoon, Carlos received an urgent message from Diane. Board emergency meeting called for 5 p.m. Howard Barnes is leading the charge. It's about Elisa, Carlos sighed, closing his eyes briefly. He had expected pushback, but not an emergency board meeting. This was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. At 5 p.m. sharp, Carlos entered the boardroom to find most members already seated. Howard Barnes, a traditionalist who had been with the company since its founding, sat at the far end of the table, his expression grim. Carlos, he began without preamble. We need to discuss what happened today with Pacific Global. They're thrilled with our progress, Carlos replied calmly. Walter Donovan specifically praised our innovative approach, both to the algorithm and to talent acquisition. That's part of the problem, Howard countered. You've turned a technical consultant role into some kind of statement about hiring practices. That wasn't the agreement when we approved her contract. Another board member, Teresa Liu, nodded in agreement. Several team leaders have expressed concerns about morale. There's a feeling that traditional qualifications and career paths are being devalued. Carlos looked around the table, measuring his response carefully. Elisa has a PhD and was a university professor. Those are very traditional qualifications. The only non-traditional part of her story is that those qualifications were ignored by this industry until she happened to be dusting the right whiteboard. That may be so, Howard replied, but the fact remains that her presence, and particularly the way you're positioning her, is causing disruption. Jack Chen has threatened to resign if this continues. He's not the only one. Jack is threatened because Elisa exposed a blind spot in his work, Carlos said, an edge creeping into his voice. And instead of learning from her, he's protecting his ego. The room fell silent. Carlos rarely showed anger, and his words hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. What exactly do you expect me to do? Carlos asked finally. Fire someone who just saved this company $200 million and impressed our biggest client, all because she makes some people uncomfortable by being better than they expected. Diane, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. No one is suggesting firing her, Carlos, but perhaps we could clarify her role. Keep her focused on the technical aspects rather than client-facing positions, at least until the team has had more time to adjust. Carlos shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. So hide her away? Let her do the work, but don't let the clients see her? Don't let them know that our breakthrough came from someone who doesn't fit the expected mold. It's not about hiding her, Teresa insisted. It's about managing a complex situation with sensitivity to all parties involved. Carlos looked at each board member in turn, then at Diane. He had known this would be difficult, but he hadn't expected to feel so alone in what seemed to him a simple matter of right and wrong. I need to think, he said finally, standing up. This meeting is adjourned until tomorrow morning. By then I'll have a decision about how we move forward. As he left the boardroom, Carlos felt the weight of competing responsibilities pressing down on him. He had a duty to the company, to its employees, to its culture, but he also had a duty to do what was right, to stand by the principles he claimed to believe in. The question now was whether he could find a way to honor both, or if he would have to choose. And if he did have to choose, what that choice would mean not just for Elisa's future, but for the soul of the company he had built. The night after the emergency board meeting, Carlos found himself on the rooftop terrace of TechVision's building. The city lights spread out before him like a constellation. He came here sometimes to think, to gain perspective when tough decisions loomed. Tonight he needed that perspective more than ever. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Another message from Jack Chen, reiterating his ultimatum. Either redefine Elisa's role or accept his resignation. 4 other senior engineers had added their names to Jack's stance. It was no longer just about one disgruntled team leader. It was becoming a movement. Mind if I join you? Carlos turned to see Diane walking toward him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He accepted one gratefully. Thought I might find you up here, she said, leaning against the railing beside him. You always did prefer the high ground when facing a battle. Carlos smiled faintly at the observation. Is that what this is? A battle, isn't it? Diane took a sip of her coffee. You're fighting for Elisa. Jack is fighting for what he sees as the proper order of things. The board is fighting to maintain stability. Everyone believes they're right. And what do you believe? Carlos asked, turning to study his oldest colleague and friend. Diane was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. I believe you're right about Elisa. She deserves to be here doing work that matters. She paused. But I also think Jack isn't entirely wrong about the disruption. Change is hard, especially when it challenges people's sense of worth. So what's the solution? Carlos asked. Hide Elisa away? Pretend her background doesn't exist? Let Jack and his allies dictate who gets to be visible in this company? You know that's not what I'm suggesting, Diane replied calmly. But there might be a middle path here that doesn't force anyone into a corner. Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. I keep thinking about what this says to all the other Elisas out there. If we back down now, what message does that send? Maybe the message isn't just in how we treat Elisa, Diane suggested. Maybe it's in how we respond to this moment as a company. Something in her words caught Carlos's attention. He straightened, an idea beginning to take shape in his mind. Not just how we treat Elisa, he repeated slowly, but how we respond to what she represents. Diane raised an eyebrow, recognizing the look on his face. You're thinking something radical, aren't you? Carlos smiled, the first genuine smile since the board meeting. Not radical, revolutionary. The next morning, Carlos arrived at the office early. He spent 2 hours in his private conference room, making calls, drafting documents, and preparing for the reconvened board meeting at 10 a.m. By the time he walked into the boardroom, he had a clear vision of what needed to happen. The board members were already seated, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. Jack Chen had been invited to present his perspective, and he sat rigidly at one end of the table. Diane entered last, taking her place beside Carlos. Thank you all for being here, Carlos began. Before we discuss the specific situation with Elisa, I want to share some information that puts this issue in a broader context. He pressed a button, and a series of charts appeared on the room's main screen. These are our hiring statistics from the past 5 years. As you can see, 87% of our technical staff come from just 12 universities. 92% followed what we consider the traditional career path: degree, internship, entry-level position, advancement. We pride ourselves on hiring the best and brightest, but what these numbers tell me is that we're actually hiring the most predictable and credentialed. Howard Barnes frowned. There's nothing wrong with valuing credentials and experience, Carlos. They're reliable indicators of ability. Sometimes, Carlos agreed, but Elisa's case proves they're not the only indicators. And by limiting ourselves to these traditional paths, we're missing out on extraordinary talent. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat. With all due respect, sir, one exceptional case doesn't invalidate an entire hiring system, doesn't it? Carlos challenged. If our system missed someone like Elisa, someone with the skills to solve a $200 million problem in seconds, how many others are we missing? How many brilliant minds are cleaning offices, driving ride shares, or working retail because our industry refuses to look past credentials to actual ability? The room fell silent as the implication of his words sank in. I've spent the morning speaking with the CEOs of 5 other tech companies, Carlos continued. Every single one of them admitted they've experienced the same blind spots in their hiring practices. They've all missed their own Elises at some point. He turned to another slide, this one showing a mock-up of a new section of the HOA website. This is why I'm proposing a complete overhaul of our approach to talent. I'm calling it the Hidden Talent Initiative. Starting today, TechVision will actively seek out overlooked talent from non-traditional backgrounds. We'll create new assessment methods that focus on actual problem-solving ability rather than credentials. We'll establish partnerships with community colleges, coding boot camps, and even community centers in underserved areas. The board members exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by the scale of what Carlos was proposing. This isn't just about Elisa anymore, Carlos continued. She was the wake-up call. This is about transforming how we think about talent, potential, and opportunity. Howard Barnes cleared his throat. Carlos, while the sentiment is admirable, this represents a significant departure from our established practices. The costs alone are minimal compared to the potential benefits, Carlos finished. Pacific Global has already expressed interest in partnering with us on this initiative. Walter Donovan called me personally this morning. He sees this as an opportunity to tap into overlooked talent pools that our competitors are ignoring. Jack Chen's face had grown increasingly pale during Carlos's presentation. And what about those of us who did follow the traditional path? Who spent years earning our credentials? Are we supposed to just accept that none of that matters anymore? Carlos turned to him, his expression softening slightly. Of course it matters, Jack. Your education, your experience, they're valuable assets to this company. But they're not the only path to excellence, and they don't entitle anyone to be the gatekeeper of opportunity for others. He addressed the entire room now. This isn't about devaluing traditional credentials. It's about expanding our definition of what constitutes valuable talent. It's about recognizing that brilliance doesn't always come packaged in the ways we expect. Diane, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. I think it's worth noting that this approach could give us a significant competitive advantage. While other companies are fighting over the same pool of candidates from elite universities, we could be discovering untapped talent that no one else is even looking for. A murmur of consideration ran through the room. Business logic was something the board understood well. And what about Elisa specifically? Teresa Liu asked. What role do you envision for her in all this? Carlos smiled. I've asked Elisa to lead our new R&D Special Projects division, reporting directly to me. Her first task will be to develop assessment methods for the Hidden Talent Initiative, ways to identify problem-solving ability regardless of background. He paused, then added, I've also asked her to serve as the public face of this initiative. Her story is powerful, it resonates, and it might just inspire other hidden talent to step forward. Jack Chen stood up abruptly. Then I believe my position here is untenable. I cannot support an approach that so fundamentally undermines the values that built this industry. Carlos met his gaze steadily. I'm sorry to hear that, Jack. Your contributions to TechVision have been significant and you'll be missed. But this is the direction we're heading with or without you. After Jack left, the boardroom erupted in debate. The discussion was heated at times, with valid concerns raised about implementation, costs, and potential risks. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The focus moved from whether to adopt this new approach to how best to execute it. By late afternoon, the board had voted, not unanimously but with a clear majority, to approve the Hidden Talent Initiative, with a 6-month trial period and quarterly reviews. As the board members filed out, Howard Barnes lingered behind. This is either the most brilliant pivot I've ever witnessed or the beginning of the end for TechVision, he said to Carlos. I genuinely can't tell which, Carlos smiled. Neither can I, Howard. But I know which side of history I want to be on. Later that day, Carlos found Elisa in her workspace, still unaware of the day's developments. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing something had changed. "So," she said, "should I start packing up my whiteboard?" "Actually," Carlos replied, "you might want to think about which office you'd prefer for your new role as Director of Special Projects." He explained the board's decision and the new initiative, watching as disbelief gave way to cautious hope on Elisa's face. "You're serious?" she asked when he finished. "You're changing the entire company's hiring philosophy because of what happened with me?" "Not just because of you," Carlos clarified. "But you showed us what was possible. You made us question assumptions we didn't even know we had. That's rare, Elisa. That's valuable." Elisa was quiet for a moment, processing everything. "What about Jack and the others who were against me being here?" "Jack has resigned," Carlos said simply. "Others might follow, but I suspect most will come around once they see the results. And if they don't, then they're not the right fit for where TechVision is heading." Carlos leaned against her whiteboard. "Change is never easy, Elisa, but sometimes it's necessary." 1 year later, the auditorium at TechVision's headquarters was filled to capacity. On stage, Carlos stood beside Elisa, now confidently addressing the crowd as the Director of Special Projects and the face of the Hidden Talent Initiative. "In just 1 year," she was saying, "we've hired 23 people through the initiative. Former teachers, retail workers, a former truck driver with an uncanny knack for algorithm optimization, and yes, even another housekeeper." This drew a wave of appreciative laughter from the audience. Their contributions have already led to 3 patent applications and an estimated $45 million in new revenue. But more importantly, they've brought perspectives that we simply didn't have before. Approaches to problems that wouldn't have occurred to those of us with more traditional backgrounds. In the front row, Walter Donovan from Pacific Global nodded approvingly. Beside him sat representatives from a dozen other major companies who had come to learn about TechVision's revolutionary approach to talent acquisition. As Elisa continued her presentation, Carlos glanced around the room. Some familiar faces were missing. Jack Chen and a few others had indeed left the company. But new faces had taken their places, bringing fresh energy and ideas. Diane caught his eye from the side of the stage and gave him a subtle thumbs up. The gamble had paid off. TechVision's stock was up 27% from the previous year, and they were being hailed as innovators not just in technology, but in human resources. After the presentation, as Carlos and Elisa fielded questions from eager representatives of other companies, a young woman approached them cautiously. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you. I was working as a barista when I read about your initiative online. I'd always been good with computers, but I never thought a company like this would look twice at someone like me without a degree." Carlos smiled. "And now?" The woman straightened proudly. "I'm starting in the junior developer program next month." Elisa reached out and squeezed the young woman's hand. "Never let anyone tell you where you belong," she said. "That's a decision only you get to make." As the event wound down, Carlos and Elisa found themselves back on the rooftop terrace where, a year earlier, the idea for the Hidden Talent Initiative had first taken shape. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Carlos asked, looking out at the city below. Elisa shook her head. "Never. When I moved here 5 years ago, all I wanted was a chance to use my mind again, to do the work I loved. I would have been grateful for any opportunity." She paused. "I certainly never expected to change an entire company's philosophy." "You didn't just change the company," Carlos said. "You're changing the industry. 3 of our competitors have already launched similar initiatives." Elisa smiled. "It's a start, but there's still so much talent out there, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to notice." Carlos nodded, thinking of the young woman they'd just met, and all the others like her whose potential remained untapped. "Then I guess we'd better keep looking." As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow across the rooftop, Carlos reflected on how a single moment, noticing Elisa glancing at his whiteboard that late night a year ago, had set in motion a transformation none of them could have predicted. It was a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from simply paying attention to the people society has trained us to overlook, and that, perhaps, was the most valuable lesson of all.